Hello, everyone, and welcome to the first of this year's Glasgow Film Festival podcasts. And I'm so pleased to be joined once again by Anthony Baxter. Hello, Anthony.
Hi, Ali. Thanks for having me on.
And we're here to talk about your new film, Eye of the Storm. And could you tell us a bit about Eye of the Storm?
Well, it follows landscape painter James Morrison, who lived here in Montrose for many years, but he had a very colourful life. He started as an artist in Glasgow, and then after that, moved to Catriona, where he was a contemporary of the late great Joan Erdley's, but spent the majority of his life here in Montrose, which is how I first came to know of him.
Right.
But he is a well-known landscape painter, but probably you could be forgiven if you haven't heard of him. I had not heard of him before I moved back to Montrose, which is where my mother is from. And it was my uncle, Dennis Rice, who appears in the film as well, who um, had said to me that James was going to give me a call after watching You've Been Trumped, the film I made about Donald Trump building a golf course resort
Mhm.
in Aberdeenshire. And uh, James actually wrote to me after watching the film and said how moved he'd been by the destruction of the landscape of these prized dunes in Aberdeenshire to make way for Donald Trump's golf course development. And he invited me over for a coffee, and Dennis came along as well. And it was at that meeting that he was talking about how he documented the landscape as well, and
Mhm.
would often paint scenes where you know the landscape was under threat. For example, trees being pulled out of the ground, plans like that. And he would capture the landscape beautifully on canvas. And during that meeting of the first meeting I had with him, he was explaining that his sight was deteriorating. He was having problems with his eyesight and was worried about going back to painting at that stage. He'd actually given it a rest for a while, and uh, so I asked him whether he would, if he went back to painting, be open to the idea of me actually following him on film, and he was open to that. And so I just started to do some exploratory filming with him, and BBC Scotland uh, commissioned the film on the basis of that early footage, and
Mhm.
then Creative Scotland as well, Screen Scotland, came on board later. Um, but it was really in his description of his trips to the Arctic as well, which he made several during his life, and capture the landscape there that made me think that there was also another dimension to this story that would
Mhm.
be really terrific cinematically. And so that's how it all started, really.
And you shot this over a kind of 2 year period, is that right?
That's right, yes. So it was during that time, really, when James goes back to painting. He picks up his brushes again, and I had the privilege of being able to follow him during that stage. He then, I would spend the odd day with him here and there. I just call him up because I'm only a couple of miles away. And I would call him up and just say, would you be open to me coming and filming with you? And James was very open to it and excited about it, actually. I mean, I think he felt it was I think we all have that experience, don't we? If we have elderly relatives and they tell us these amazing stories,
Mhm.
and often I think with my uncle Dennis, for example, here, who's 88 years old, I'd love to record these stories and get them down on tape, because once they leave us, they're gone. Those
Yeah.
stories and so there was an element, I think, of that he appreciated, being able to put on record some of his life experiences. And he also has a great sense of humor, lovely anecdotes that when he's telling them to you can visualize them. And so I also, I'm sure we'll talk about the animation in the film, but that was one of the things that I felt was was a possibility to bring to life some of these anecdotes and some of the things that James had experienced in his life.
That's what I thought watching it, in that you kind of lucked out with the way he tells a story. I almost in that kind of great Glasgow storytelling tradition. He's got that kind of ease, and he takes great joy in telling the stories as well. I thought that was fantastic.
Yes, you're absolutely right about that. I mean, he would be able to remember great details of these stories and the people that he'd met, because he was always painting outdoors. He never painted from photographs. I mean, latterly in his life, he would, as you see in the film, when I was filming with him, he'd be inspired by some of his earlier works, and he'd go back through catalogues, because he wasn't, as he said, allowed to paint outside anymore, because of his fading eyesight and other health issues. And but in his early career, and right up until recently, really, he was painting outside. And so when he was in Glasgow painting his tenement paintings, people would come and chat to him, and he would recount those tales. And also in Glasgow's art gallery, there's that lovely story as well that he recounts, where somebody comes in and essentially criticizes his painting, but they don't know it's the artist they're standing next to. And he has this lovely turn of phrase in throughout. And then when it comes to the Arctic, when he's talking about his dramatic trips there, where he shipped over from Montrose these canvases to the Arctic to paint on. I mean, it's extraordinary, really, to think of that. I mean, right in the middle of nowhere, incredibly difficult part of the world to get to, and having his canvases boxed up here in Montrose, airlifted out to the Arctic so he could paint. And there as well, he would be talking to the people he was with, of course. And so all through his life, he'd be very happy, I think, to share his knowledge and experience with people as he was carrying out his work.
Yeah, I mean, he was a teacher as well, wasn't he, for most of his life? And that comes
Yeah.
across almost as much as he loved to paint, he loved to teach and share his experience and share his knowledge. It seems to be essential to who he was.
That's right. Yeah, there was a big over a decade. He was a teacher in Dundee, and also taught in Stonehaven as well. And so yes, he talks about how much he enjoyed teaching, and it certainly comes across. There's something about watching an artist at work as well that I think is fascinating. It's a bit like when you're filming a singer-songwriter in a recording studio, or a chef in a kitchen. There's something about the way that you have an insight into how this person operates,
Yeah.
and has these skills that are just so unique, and built up over so many years, and very open and willing to share that knowledge and professional ability with you and the audience and the viewer. So he very quickly, I think, grew accustomed to me being in the room, and it was just me filming with him. And so I was able to develop, I think, that kind of intimacy that you can in that level, when you've just got one camera. I had one other camera up on this platform that he has in the studio, which was useful to have, but it was good as well, because he would get quite tired. And so I wouldn't want to film with him for anything over an hour, really, in a stretch. And then we break, have a coffee, and his partner Anne would come into the room, and we'd have a chat, and then I might do a little bit more. But sometimes he'd say, "Look, I'm just, I think I'll leave it for today," and then I would call him a couple of days later, and he'd be really happy to continue as well. And I think that was the thing for him. It was almost possibly a therapeutic thing, going through the filming of the documentary. It allowed him to share these experiences, and to talk and to have company. And I think one of the things I've noticed during the whole COVID pandemic is, from my elderly relatives, is how important company is, and how telling stories and sharing experiences and life experiences with relatives or friends is crucially important. And of course, so many people denied of that at the moment.
Yeah. I think that's a really interesting point. My parents have both been for their vaccines, and it became a big day out, which gave them a lift because they were going out with purpose and actually,
Yeah.
to meet other people. And I think that is something that comes across.
Yes,
So
no, absolutely.
you have all the footage that you've shot, and I'm interested in how you begin to edit that footage into a story, if you like, how you decide how you're going to tell the story.
Well, I think the main thing was starting at the beginning. After we see the first scene is actually in the art gallery in Edinburgh in January of 2020, where he is staging what turned out to be, very sadly, his last exhibition and the preparations for that. But to have a little introduction to um, his weight as an artist, in a way, I felt was quite important at the beginning. And then to go back to James in the studio painting and beginning to tell his life story. He was the only son of a fitter in the shipyards in Glasgow. So he came from a pretty, I think, obviously decided pretty early on, that is not what I want to do. Um, and when I was looking back actually through some of that extraordinary footage of the shipyards in Glasgow, you realize just what a life that was for those men, and they were all men working there on these boats, and incredible noise and sheer hard work every day. And James decided quite early on that he wanted to follow a very different path. He went to Glasgow School of Art, and he recounts a couple of stories from his time there. And then, as he describes, the thing for him was the landscape that he saw every day were the tenements of Glasgow, and that became his first kind of introduction, I suppose, to landscape painting. And he also says that people were never of interest to him as a subject. I mean, his paintings never had people in them. And people would sometimes say, "Oh, why don't you put a couple of people in there?" And he describes in the film how they're an irrelevance. They get in the way, really, of what the landscape is doing and what the landscape is about. So he, after Glasgow, moves to Cataline, and as I mentioned, was a contemporary of the late great Joan Erdley there, who, of course, focused entirely on people, really, in Glasgow. When she was in Cataline, she did landscapes too. And I think he talks about, there's some old film footage that you see of him in Cataline as a younger man presenting a program about Joan Erdley not long after her death. And he talks in that, I think, about how probably he felt he needed to leave Cataline because she was such a huge figure at the time, really, in the artistic world. And had an exhibition in London that he describes, and he then decides to leave Cataline, move to Montrose, and he actually lived nearer to Ferry Den, just over the river from where I am, and that was his home for many, many years. So in a way, it was just following, it was quite easy on one level because it was just following the story of his life. And then you didn't have to mess around too much with that because it all kind of, flowed, unlike some other films I've done where that structure is really tricky. But here it was pretty chronological, really.
And that, in comparison with Joan Erdley, I think is a really interesting one, because as you say, they both kind of started painting the streets of Glasgow, but Joan's famously have these children, mainly children in her kind of earlier pictures, and then they both go to Cataline and paint the landscape there and the seascapes and all of that stuff. But what struck me with James Morrison's was it was the first time I'd thought of the Glasgow tenements as landscape paintings. Because there's no paint, and you go, oh, it's just a different landscape. And that's what he did so beautifully, it seemed to me, was to capture both.
That's right. And I think those early tenement paintings of his, I absolutely love. They're tricky to find nowadays, and there are a few around publicly, but they are really stunning pictures and documents of their time. And so when he's then in the landscape, out in the landscape, he's got this incredible ability to relay texture and tone and detail. And some artists you might see who use a lot of detail can sometimes then possibly lose the spiritual context of the work. Sometimes, you can find there's too much detail, but James, through his beautiful depiction of skies and tone, allows the viewer, I think, to go on a journey with him. And you see the sky and the landscape in a very different way after experiencing a James Morrison painting. And I find that when I walk around here in Montrose and look up at the sky, I think of it as my Uncle Dennis says in the film, that there's a James Morrison sky. It has a kind of a feeling almost as if it's, Dennis described it as God imitating Jimmy Morrison, and it's a little bit like that. You look up and you see this beautiful texture that James has grasped and accomplished on a canvas, and allows you to see that in nature. So it's actually a really helpful thing, I think, at this time in this COVID period where we're all locked up in our homes and really missing friends and family and not being able to do things that we'd like to do, and then being able to walk outside and see the landscape, which in James's world has no people. There is no pandemic. It's just the landscape. It's what the landscape is and always has been. And that is a helpful thing too, I think.
And I mean, it is a visually stunning film. And it did make me wonder if the way that James captured the landscape influenced the way that you wanted to capture it in your film.
Very much so, Ali. I mean, it's almost like I felt quite a weight to try and do the landscape justice compared to James's paintings. But anybody will know from visiting Angus or, the west coast of Scotland where James painted too, that you don't have to do a lot other than turn the camera on and you've got some incredible footage. And it sort of helped as well, I think, by I used some of Kareem Polwarth's songs, which I always felt really complemented James's work, and they help, I think, too, just to have that lyrical addition to his work, and that can help the viewer too, possibly, I hope.
I think you're right. I think Kareem's music, like the James' paintings, hint at something bigger than all of us. There's a kind of something going on that perhaps it's not easily captured.
Yes, and it's lovely as well to be able to bring other artists into a film like this, and that's how using Kareem's music, and then Catriona Black, who did this beautiful animation in the film, and being able to show her process too, because sadly Catriona didn't get to meet James. She wanted to. In fact, actually, when we were filming here in Montrose, James had moved into a home at that point, and I was planning to go with Catriona to the home because it was before the COVID situation, and so we would have been able to go and see him, but we just ran out of time on that day, so she didn't actually get a chance to meet him, which was a real shame, because he knew of what I was doing with Catriona, and he really approved of it, because I think he loved the idea of another artist working and interpreting something. And at that stage too, we didn't have that footage of him painting in the Arctic. That emerged after he had died. And so Catriona did this incredible job of imagining James's trips to the Arctic, and using his paintings as a backdrop, as the canvas on which she worked from, and using his tone and his color palette as an inspiration for her own animation work. And she does that beautifully, I think, with the Arctic animation, and then using James's tenement paintings as an inspiration for the animation in Glasgow, and then also his work in Cataline as an inspiration for a very short little scene there too. So there's a real journey, I think, too, as well with Catriona, and I think that that helps to bring this creativity throughout the film is what I was aiming for anyway. Viewers will be able to tell me whether it's successful or not, I'm sure.
Well, I mean, the animation is a delight because you have him telling these stories, and then with some of them, Catriona has animated them, and it just brings another aspect to it, I think.
Yeah, that's right. It's a tricky thing, animation, because you can. I've worked with it before on other films where it's in a title sequence, or you're using animation to describe some numbers. Obviously, in news reports, you see that all the time, or during the COVID pandemic, and it works very well because you're almost expecting somebody to show you with some graphic what's going on. And in a film, it's a little trickier because you don't want to suddenly take the viewer out into a different world that they don't feel comfortable in. And so you've got to try and meld it in with the film. And so I think that's what I was trying to do with Catriona. And she was a real joy to work with because she would be able to interpret ideas in a storyboard that I would send her. And then when you're working with somebody who's on the same wavelength as you, it's just so helpful because you could be going down into the weeds so easily on this kind of thing and finding that you're just not on the same wavelength. You could be working with an animator who's maybe too whimsical or bringing a different kind of style or something to it that is interesting but just doesn't quite work. And of course, the other thing with animation is it's incredibly expensive. I mean, if you're doing 25 frames of drawing for every second that's on the screen and you're going off on a different tack, then that
Yeah.
becomes an expensive mistake. So it's important to be on the same wavelength and to try and get it right. And you know, and actually it was down to that support from Screen Scotland and Creative Scotland that we were able to do that extra layer to the film, because without that, it wouldn't have been possible. So that was a really nice, possibility at the time to be able to do that.
So at the beginning, do you have an ideal of how you want your film to be, and then you've got to match that with finance? And did you end up with the film that you kind of envisaged at the beginning?
No, very different film, I think, in the sense that, I mean, the part with James was pretty much what I thought it might be, in the sense that I'd done some early filming with him. And so I knew how and what a pleasure and privilege it would be to work with him on that one-on-one level. With the Arctic material, I mean, early on, I'd applied to Screen Scotland for funding to go to the Arctic and to actually um, document James's journeys and adventures there as a documentarian on film, and possibly using some drama reenactment as well. And not only did it become very clear that that would be really expensive to do, I mean, to get to the Arctic, I then thought about possibly filming in the Highlands of Scotland during the winter of 2019, early 20, to do that. But I then had this thought about animation, and I had seen some of Catriona's work. An author friend of mine, Mike Nicholson, suggested I looked closely at what she had done with the horrendous disaster on the Isle of Lewis in 1918, when the sailors come back from the war. having survived the trenches for 4 years, and then the boat they are on goes down on New Year's Eve, and dozens and dozens are drowned. And she did this beautiful, very moving short animation for BBC Alba on that, which is well worth looking up on the internet. I think there's a trailer available still, and you get a sense of that painterly quality that she has.
Yeah.
And so I spoke with her, and it just so happened she had the possibility of doing it too. And then, of course, lockdown happened in the end, beginning of March, and so we were able to work very easily in that sense of being locked down and working with an animator. And Catriona's currently based in Amsterdam, and so we were able to communicate, easily enough on Skype and Zoom, and sharing her early drafts that way. And so that, in that sense, it did turn out to be quite a different idea to the original one, but that was sort of part of it. And I think I'm really pleased that, although I'd love to go to the Arctic one day, I'm really pleased with the way that aspect of it turned out, because it sort of meant a lot to be able to work with her, and to have that extra dimension to the film was a really important one.
And I think it actually adds a bit of mystery to that trip as well, because he comes back, and I think originally he wants to write about it, but it's almost too overwhelming a trip for him. It was like, no, the thought of it brought him to tears almost. And I think animating it rather than filming it, you can imagine it for yourself rather than seeing it.
Yeah, that's true, I think, Ali. And I think as well that it's I really just am in awe, really, of what Catriona's done with that, because it would be so easy to go off piste and to find it sort of just not working. And I think that it really is wonderful what she's created there. It allows you to enter into this world, this mystique in a way of his trip, and then you come back to him in Scotland. And so it and then when we found that early footage after he had died in August of last year, his son John, and I was quite advanced in the editing at the time, said, "Oh, by the way, I was just going through some of Dad's things and found this old videotape would you be interested in taking a look?" So, of course I would be. And so so that then emerged, and we were then able to bring in a little bit of that footage into the scene too. So you go into the animation, you then see him in situ, and then you go back to the animation, and that works because Catriona had amazingly done this incredible job of just imagining what it would be like for him. She'd got it pretty bang on. I mean, there were a couple of early photographs that she had, but that's all she had. There was just no other materials that she had to work from about the other people who were with him, for example, that kind of thing, and the setup.
It's an incredible story that I think there's 4 people originally, and you've got this pilot referred to as the Arctic Fox, who, with his bottle of whiskey under his arm, there's a picture of him there. And it just seems like something from such a different age, almost Scott of the Antarctic kind of thing, in a small plane flying up to that part of the world. It's quite incredible.
Absolutely. And I think that's what it would have been like. I mean, who wouldn't want to experience that? I mean, an incredible opportunity for James to do that, which all came out of a chance meeting at one of his exhibitions at the Scottish Gallery in Edinburgh, where he had 25 over his lifetime. And a philanthropist woman who suggested that he should go, and he went, and so started this love affair, really, with the Arctic. I think he was just mesmerized by its beauty and that feeling of being there in that wilderness, with an untouched landscape, and with global warming and all that we know now about the ice caps melting and that landscape not being here in the same form as it was when he painted it. It has an extra significance, and he was actually being an unwitting documentarian of that landscape. He didn't go there to document melting ice caps or anything, but he, in doing so, recorded very clearly this landscape that doesn't exist in the same form as it did when he was painting it.
Yeah. Yeah. And I was thinking it was almost like the ultimate landscape. He'd gone from the kind of closed in streets and tenements that he was painting to wider, more rural Caterline, and you say then Montrose, but the Arctic is almost the ultimate, isn't it? I mean,
That's right.
if you're taking people out of the equation, then you're really taking them out of the equation.
No, absolutely, absolutely. I mean, you can't think of anywhere more remote and people less than the Arctic, and so he didn't have to worry about not painting people there. And yes, I mean, just extraordinary also to think of the technical challenges of working in those sub-zero temperatures. And obviously, anybody who lives in Montrose knows that you have to be prepared for all weathers all year round, something wet and something waterproof, even if it's summer. But in the Arctic, you're in this situation of having these extra dimension problems of paints freezing, having to warm them up, having to work, if you're working outside, working in those incredibly cold, bitter conditions, and not being able to just come in and put your feet up in front of a fire at the end of the day. Just living in a camp and going through that for quite a long period of time. And so he and also then wanting to go back for more, so that I think he just had a sense of adventure and spirit that really comes across through his stories and through his work, because those works wouldn't exist if he didn't have that sense of adventure.
Yeah, and there was a sentence, I think it might have been his son that said it, but I'm not sure. It says the desire to be creative was what drove him. It wasn't like the idea that this is my job or anything. This is something that, was inside him and that they had to do.
Yeah, that's right. And, I think his creativity is so apparent throughout his life, whether it is through his canvas paintings, but also his or on board, or his paintings of that he shows us of where you can open up a door into a painting, and he has this playing with things like 3D in that sense. And even in his house was littered with wonderful work of sculptures and people who inspired him as an artist too. And so there's a real sense, I think, of him absorbing creativity and then being able to relay it in his own work in a way that was just absolutely unique. And I think the nice thing about it, being able to bring this film out, is that a lot of people, won't have heard of James Morrison. And as I say, I hadn't before I moved back here to where my mother was from. And then you kind of realize quickly just what a talent he was, and what a hard worker he was, with a huge volume of work over his lifetime. And although there are famous people who may own his paintings, it has an accessibility to us all, really. You don't have to be an art lover or an artist to appreciate, his incredible interpretation of the landscape and the sky.
Yeah. Well, I didn't know him, and I've got friends and family who are in the art business, and they knew the name, and some of them did know his work. But it's that kind of, if this film does nothing else, it brings him to a wider kind of audience, which is fantastic.
Yeah, I mean, that's the hope. And I think, once we, and fortunately as well, we've done this audio descriptive soundtrack too, so that people with impaired vision, through the RNIB support as well, we've devised this audio descriptive soundtrack, which allows people who, like James, were suffering from sight loss to appreciate and enjoy his paintings through an audio platform too. And that, I think, is something that he'd really appreciate, because he understood how terribly difficult that was to lose his ability, that it was so important to him, of course, as an artist, to be able to see. And to hear his paintings interpreted, I hope will bring his work to an even bigger audience. And we've done a link up with art galleries and independent cinemas that are closed due to the COVID pandemic around the country, where through their own VOD platforms or through art galleries putting it on their websites, that people will be able to choose that audio descriptive version of the film as well. That's all before the BBC broadcast a shorter version of it, and then the longer version at a later date.
Oh, that's fantastic. Now, I couldn't have you on, someone who's made films about Donald Trump, and not ask you about the final days of that regime. What did you make when you were watching, the kind of fall of Trump, if you like?
Well, I mean, when the riots were unfolding at the Capitol, I was feeling this sense of shock at watching what was happening, but not surprised.
Yeah.
I think that there was a feeling that everything was leading up to that kind of a moment. And it was interesting seeing the footage of Donald Trump and his son Trump Jr. In the marquee ahead of that rally, which led to the Capitol riots, and having a celebration inside this marquee. And it really reminded me of the early days of following Trump coming to Scotland and the marquee on the Many estate, where he was there celebrating, and the lies that were told there that had devastating impact on the environment here in Scotland. And of course, during his presidency, the thousands of lies, according to the Washington Post, that were told. And to then see the devastating effects that had. And so it was sickening, of course, to watch, and then also to see him failing to condemn it. But I think that is something that those of us who have followed him over a long period of time have come used to, in a way, his inability to ever concede that something might not have gone according to his plan. And he would never say sorry or ever admit that he'd made any kind of a mistake. And so I think as the world is breathing a sigh of relief and taking stock at the moment, I think we have to really use this opportunity to learn lessons. And my fear is that, at least with another golf course given the green light in Aberdeenshire at the end of last year, that those lessons may not be learned. And there has to be some accountability here of the deception of this lie that was told to the people of Scotland and to politicians here, but then of course on a much bigger scale, as I always felt that the Scottish story was a microcosm for what could happen on a world stage if Trump became president, and to really learn lessons from that too, because it has such a huge impact, whether it's the lies told about the science surrounding COVID, or whether it's other conspiracy theories that are given weight by Donald Trump's backing or failure to discourage that kind of falsehood that goes haywire on the internet. Then I sort of feel that we're in this very precarious situation always. So that's my thoughts on that one for the moment. And I just sort of feel that we're in this kind of pause period, and that there is an opportunity to take stock and learn from this.
Yeah, and that's exactly what I thought. Having watched your films, was that this is actually consistent behavior. This is not some move away from the norm. This is kind of how he's always done it.
Yeah, that's right.
Well, Anthony, thanks so much for talking to me today. It's an absolute pleasure.
Oh, thanks, Ali. No, thank you for watching the film and for talking about it as well. Really, really pleased to be here and do that with you.
And best of luck with the film, because it really deserves to be seen by a wide audience.
Oh, lovely. Thank you. Thanks for that.
And we'll be back soon with someone completely different.